On the 24th of May, 1943, the man who ran Germany's submarine war did something he had never done before. He ordered his U-boats to retreat. For nearly 4 years, the wolf packs had been the terror of the Atlantic. The single weapon that Winston Churchill would later admit frightened him more than anything else in the entire war. And now their commander, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, pulled them back from the North Atlantic convoy routes, because in the space of a few weeks, the hunters had become the hunted. In the month that would come to be known in the German Navy as Black May, Dönitz lost 41 submarines. A generation of his most experienced commanders went to the bottom with them, and he could not understand why. The convoys were slipping around his patrol lines as though someone were drawing them a map. His boats were being found in the open ocean, at night, in fog, by escorts that seemed to know exactly where to look. Dönitz was not a careless man. He was meticulous, suspicious, and technically sharp, and he asked the only question that could account for what he was seeing. He asked whether the enemy was reading his secret radio traffic. He asked whether the Cipher machine at the heart of the entire German war effort, the machine his experts had sworn was unbreakable, had somehow been broken. And his experts investigated, and they came back to him, as they always did, with the same answer: it cannot be done. The machine is secure. The mathematics are on our side. Look elsewhere. It must be radar. It must be a spy. It cannot be the Cipher. Pause on that for a moment, because this is not a story about submarines. This is a story about certainty. It is a story about how a nation can build something so perfect, so mathematically flawless, that it slowly loses the ability to imagine the thing could ever fail. This is the story of how Britain read the mind of the German High Command for most of the Second World War. And it is the story of why the men who ran that war went to their graves refusing to believe it had happened at all. This is the story of the cipher they called Enigma. To understand why a German admiral could not accept that his cipher was broken, you first have to understand why the Germans trusted it so completely. And to understand that, you have to understand the machine itself, because the confidence was not simple arrogance. Inside the frame the Germans were thinking in, the confidence was almost entirely correct. Enigma was not a code. A code swaps whole words for other words, and codes can be stolen, captured, and memorized. Enigma was a cipher machine, an electric device shaped a little like a typewriter that scrambled every single letter on its own, according to a setting that shifted with every keystroke and reset itself completely every 24 hours. It was invented by a German engineer named Arthur Scherbius at the end of the First World War, sold commercially in the 1920s, and taken up by the German military from 1926 onward. By the time the Second World War began, it had been refined into something the German armed forces regarded as beyond the reach of any human being. Here is how it worked, and the details matter, because the details are the whole story. The operator sat at a keyboard that looked much like a typewriter. Above the keys sat a panel of small lamps, one for each letter of the alphabet. When he pressed a key, an electric current travelled through a series of rotating wheels, called rotors, and each rotor scrambled that letter into a different one. There were 3 rotors inside the machine at any one time, chosen from a set of 5, and each rotor could be set to any of 26 starting positions. After the current passed through the 3 rotors, it struck a component at the far end called the reflector, which sent the current back through the 3 rotors again by a different path. Then, before it reached the lamps, it passed through one more layer, a plug board on the front of the machine, where pairs of letters were joined by cables and swapped for one another. The result of all this was that pressing the letter A might light up the lamp for T. Press A again, and because the rotors had already turned one step, it might light up G instead. The same letter, pressed twice in a row, produced 2 different results. There was no pattern a human eye could follow, and the total number of ways the machine could be set up, counting the choice of rotors, their order, their starting positions, and the plugboard connections, came to a figure the Germans recited to themselves almost like a prayer: 158 million, million, million. Written out, that is a 15 followed by 18 more digits. The Germans believed, with real justification, that a number that large was a wall no enemy could ever climb. But there was a flaw in the wall. There were, in truth, several, and they were not flaws of arithmetic. They were flaws of design and flaws of habit. The first was buried in that reflector at the end of the machine, the clever piece that sent the current back through the rotors. Because of the way it worked, a letter could never, ever be enciphered as itself. Press A, and the machine could light up any lamp except the lamp for A. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. It meant that anyone trying to guess the hidden contents of a message had a tool. If you suspected that a certain stretch of scrambled text contained a particular German word, you could slide that word along the text, and anywhere a letter lined up with itself, you knew instantly that your guess was wrong in that position. The machine could never break this rule. The rule never took a day off. It was a crack of light under a locked door, and the British would learn to work it open with their fingernails. The second flaw was the human being operating the machine. The mathematics assumed the operators would behave perfectly, choosing settings at random, never repeating themselves, never taking shortcuts. Real men, tired, cold, bored, working night shifts in submarines and bunkers, did not behave perfectly. They chose the same three-letter settings again and again. They used their girlfriend's initials. They ran their fingers straight down a column of keys. They began their messages with the same predictable words. Every one of these habits was a thread, and threads can be pulled. And there was a third thing, the deepest of them all, though it was not a flaw in the machine at all. It was a flaw in the mind. The Germans had proven to themselves, by counting the combinations, that Enigma could not be broken by brute force, by simply trying every possible setting one after another until the message fell out. They were entirely right about that. And having proven the one thing, they quietly convinced themselves of a different and much larger thing. They convinced themselves that the machine could not be broken at all, by any method whatsoever. They had confused one kind of impossibility for every kind. That single mental leap from this cannot be done one particular way to this cannot be done in any way is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Now we cross to the other side, and here we have to correct the story that most people think they know. Because the breaking of Enigma did not begin in England. It began in Poland more than a decade before the war, and it began with three young mathematicians whose names deserve to be spoken far more often than they are. In the late 1920s, the Polish Cipher Bureau made a decision that the great powers had not. It decided that breaking modern machine ciphers was a job not for old soldiers and puzzle enthusiasts, but for mathematicians. It recruited from the University of Poznan, and among the young men it found was a quiet, brilliant mathematician named Marian Rejewski. Alongside him worked two others, Jerzy Rosicki and Henryk Zygalski. Poland had every reason to be afraid of Germany, and every reason to listen to whatever the German army was saying to itself over the airwaves. What Rejewski did next was, by any measure, one of the greatest single feats in the entire history of code-breaking. Working largely alone, using intercepted messages, a little material passed to the Poles by French intelligence, and the pure theory of mathematical permutations, he reconstructed the internal wiring of the German military Enigma without ever having seen inside one. He worked out, from the scrambled letters alone, how the rotors were built. Experts in other countries had assumed this was flatly impossible. Rejewski did it in a matter of weeks, around the end of 1932. The Poles then built their own working copies of the machine, called doubles, and by the middle of the 1930s, they were reading a great deal of Germany's secret traffic. To speed the work, Rejewski designed an electromechanical device that tested rotor settings automatically, and he gave it a name that would echo through the rest of this story. He called it the Bomber. Then the walls began to close in. Through the late 1930s, the Germans made the machine steadily more complex, adding more rotors to choose from and more plugboard cables, and the Polish effort, starved of money and machines, began to fall behind. But the Poles could see the invasion coming, and so they made a decision of extraordinary generosity and extraordinary consequence. In late July 1939, just 5 weeks before German tanks crossed their border, they invited British and French intelligence to a secret meeting in a forest south of Warsaw. And there they gave everything away, every technique, every insight, a complete working replica of the German military Enigma handed over to men who had, until that very moment, believed the machine was essentially unbreakable. The British officers went home stunned. Years later, the man who would design the British attack on Enigma admitted the debt plainly. He wrote that the British effort would never have gotten off the ground had they not learned, in the nick of time, from the Poles. So before we go a single step further into the English countryside, let that fact stand where it belongs, at the very front. The foundation stone of the whole cathedral was laid in Poland, and the men who laid it were not rewarded for it. Rosicki did not survive the war. He drowned in the Mediterranean in early 1942, when the ship carrying him back from a posting sank. Rejewski and Zygalski escaped to Britain, but because they had spent time in occupied France and might have been compromised, they were judged a security risk, and they were never allowed inside the very effort they had made possible. They spent the war solving lesser ciphers in a Polish signals unit, never told what their gift had grown into. That is a debt history took far too long to acknowledge. Which brings us, at last, to a Victorian mansion in the English Midlands. 50 miles northwest of London, in the town of Bletchley, stood a large and famously ugly country house. One writer called it a maudlin and monstrous pile. It sat where the railway lines between Oxford and Cambridge crossed, which was the entire point, because the two universities were where the finest minds in Britain lived, and the trains could carry those minds to this spot in about an hour. In the summer of 1939, the head of Britain's Secret Intelligence Service quietly bought the estate, using roughly £6,000 of his own money, and Britain's codebreakers began to move in. On paper, it was a country house owned by a wealthy gentleman. In reality, it was becoming the largest and strangest intelligence factory the world had ever seen. They called it Bletchley Park. In their own private correspondence, they called it Station X. The people who filled it were not soldiers, and this is the part that matters most. It is the deep engine underneath everything that follows. Britain, faced with a machine it could not break, went looking not for its most senior officers, but for its most unusual minds, wherever they happened to be hiding. It recruited mathematicians and chess champions. It recruited classical scholars who could read ancient Greek, and linguists who dreamed in German. Famously, it planted a fiendish crossword puzzle in a national newspaper, and quietly approached readers who could finish it in under 12 minutes, on the theory that a mind that could do that might be turned to other kinds of puzzles. It gathered debutantes and university dons, crossword addicts and physicists, and it threw them together into wooden huts and told them to do the impossible, and to never, ever tell a soul they were doing it. There was a genuine method hidden inside this apparent eccentricity. A country that recruits only from its generals gets the thinking of its generals. A country that recruits a chess champion, a crossword setter, a professor of ancient languages, and a shy young mathematician, and then locks them in a room together, gets ways of seeing a problem that no single tradition could ever have produced on its own. The German cipher had been designed by brilliant, orthodox minds, and it was very nearly perfect against every orthodox attack. What undid it was a collision of unorthodox minds who did not know that the thing was supposed to be impossible, or who simply did not care. This mixing of talents, this willingness to let the unlikely person into the room, was not something Bletchley stumbled upon by luck alone. It was, in its quiet way, a national habit, and it was about to pay the largest dividend in the history of secret intelligence. At the centre of them was a young Cambridge mathematician, who is now among the most famous scientists who ever lived, and who was then almost entirely unknown. His name was Alan Turing. He was in his late 20s. He was shy, brilliant, socially awkward, careless about his appearance, and given to strange small habits, such as chaining his tea mug to a radiator so no one would take it. He thought about problems in ways the people around him could not quite follow, and he had, before the war, already written a theoretical paper imagining a universal machine that could compute anything that could be computed, a paper that lies at the foundation of every computer you have ever touched. Turing did not look like the saviour of a nation. He looked like an eccentric who had wandered in from a lecture hall. He was exactly the kind of man that only a very particular kind of country would ever have handed the keys to its survival. Turing understood something that the older methods had failed to grasp. The tricks that depended on specific German habits would keep breaking down every time the Germans tightened their procedures, and the Germans did exactly that. In the first year of the war, they relied on a lazy habit in which the operator enciphered the short setting for his message twice at the very beginning, a doubling that the Poles had feasted upon. In May 1940, on the eve of the German assault in the West, that doubling was abolished, and overnight one of the great Polish methods went dead. Britain could not build its war on tricks that the enemy might cancel with a single order. What was needed was not a trick tied to one weakness, but a machine that attacked the logic of Enigma itself, a machine that could be aimed at the traffic no matter how the enemy adjusted his settings. And so Turing designed one. In honor of the Polish device that had come before it, the British machine kept a version of the old name. They called it the bomb. The bomb was not a computer. It did not think, and it did not calculate in the way we mean that word today. It was a large, heavy, noisy assembly of rotating drums, each drum imitating the action of an Enigma rotor, wired together so that many imaginary Enigma machines ran side by side at once. Its purpose was to take a guess and test that guess at inhuman speed. The guess was the key to the whole method, and the code breakers had a word for it. They called it a crib. A crib was a piece of text they believed was hidden inside a scrambled message. German messages were often maddeningly predictable. A weather station would report the conditions in the same phrasing every single morning. A quiet outpost with nothing to say would send a message that decoded to the words, "nothing to report." Messages ended with the same formal salute to the leader. Each of these was a crib, a corner of known truth poking out of an ocean of scrambled letters. The bomb took that crib and used the machine's own greatest weakness against it. Remember that no letter could ever be enciphered as itself. That single rule let the code breakers line up a crib against the scrambled text and throw away every position where a letter would have to clash with itself. What remained was a much smaller set of possibilities that the bomb could grind through, spinning its drums, following chains of logical deduction, eliminating every setting that produced a contradiction. When the machine reached a setting that broke none of its logical rules, it stopped. A woman operating it would note the position, and that stop would be tested by hand. Most stops were false trails that led nowhere. But some were the day's key, the master setting that unlocked every German message on that network for the next 24 hours. There was a further stroke of genius that made the bomb truly deadly, and it came from another Cambridge mathematician named Gordon Welchman. Welchman realized that the plugboard connections worked in both directions. If a cable joined A to N, then it equally joined N to A. He designed an addition to the machine, a piece of wiring called the diagonal board, that fed this simple truth back into the logic and multiplied its power enormously, throwing out false answers by the thousand. The machines themselves were built not in a laboratory, but by a business machine company in the town of Letchworth, turned into reliable hardware by a gifted engineer named Harold Keane. The first arrived in the spring of 1940. The improved version, carrying Welchman's diagonal board, arrived that August. In time, there would be around 210 of them running across a network of guarded sites. But before any Bombay could work, someone had to hand it away in, and in the early days that often meant nothing more than the mistakes of exhausted German operators. The code breakers had a private, affectionate word for these gifts. They called them sillies. The name is said to have come from an operator who, told to choose 3 random letters for his setting, kept using the letters C, I, L, perhaps the initials of a girlfriend, and by doing so handed Bletchley a foothold day after day. Whenever a man reused a setting, or chose 3 letters that sat next to each other on the keyboard, or repeated the last setting of his previous message, he narrowed the search from an ocean to a puddle. There was a young codebreaker named John Herrivel who sat one evening imagining himself into the mind of a tired German soldier at the start of a shift, and guessed that such a man, out of pure laziness, might leave his rotors close to where he had left them the night before, rather than spinning them properly to a fresh position. This insight became known as the Herrivel tip, and for a crucial stretch it was one of the ways Bletchley found its footing each morning. The lesson underneath it is worth holding on to. The machine was flawless. The people were not. And a cipher is only ever as strong as the weariest, most bored human being who has to use it at 3 in the morning. The first great proof that this strange new intelligence could change the course of a battle came not against Germany at all. It came against Germany's ally, Italy, at sea in the spring of 1941. The Italian Navy used its own version of the Enigma machine, one without the plug board that made the German Army version so formidable, and the task of breaking it fell largely to a brilliant, eccentric classical scholar named Dilly Knox, a veteran codebreaker from the First World War who worked in a cottage in the stable yard and thought in riddles. On his small team was a young woman named Mavis Lever, still in her late teens when she began, who would later marry a fellow codebreaker and become known to history under her married name of Mavis Beatty as one of the most celebrated figures of the whole effort. Late in March 1941, the team broke open Italian signals, revealing that the Italian fleet was putting to sea to attack the British convoys carrying troops between Egypt and Greece. Bletchley knew the enemy was coming before the enemy had even reached open water. The intelligence was passed to the British Mediterranean Fleet under Admiral Andrew Cunningham, and Cunningham took great care not to reveal how much he knew. On the day his fleet sailed to intercept, he made a show of going ashore at Alexandria with his golf clubs, so that any watching enemy agent would report that the British admiral was settling in for a quiet weekend. That night he slipped back aboard and put to sea. In the darkness off Cape Matapan, at the southern tip of Greece, the British fleet fell upon the Italian ships that had no idea they were expected. In a night action fought at close range, the Royal Navy sank 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers and killed thousands of Italian sailors for almost no loss of its own. It broke the back of the Italian surface fleet in the Mediterranean. Cunningham came in person to Bletchley Park afterward to thank the codebreakers, offering a toast, as he put it, to Dilly and his girls. It was the first time the Royal Navy had won a fleet action on the strength of broken Enigma, a battle decided in the dark by a signal read in a wooden hut hundreds of miles away. It would not be the last. And here we must widen the lens, because a machine is only as good as the world that feeds it. The bomb needed cribs, and cribs had to be manufactured, stolen, and coaxed out of the enemy. This is where Bletchley Park became something far larger than a room full of geniuses. It became an industrial operation, employing by the last full year of the war nearly 9,000 people, working around the clock in 3 shifts, and roughly 3/4 of them were women. That fact deserves to sit in the light for a moment, because for decades it sat in the dark. The great majority of the people who broke the German ciphers, day after day, were women. Many were members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, known as the Wrens. They operated the bombs, and the work was punishing. The machines stood over 6 feet tall. They were loud, they threw off heat, they stank of hot machine oil, and the rooms were cramped and badly lit. One operator called her machine room the hell hole, a place of noise and smell and no air. The women plugged and unplugged the drums by hand, following instructions they did not understand, ran the machines through the night, phoned the results back to the codebreakers, and were told nothing about what any of it meant. And then they kept that silence for 30 years. Many went to their graves having never told their own husbands or their own children what they had done in the war. As the operation grew too large for the grounds of Bletchley itself, the bombs were dispersed to outstations in the suburbs northwest of London, at places called Eastcote and Stanmore, where the largest concentrations of machines and Wrens were housed behind barbed wire and armed guards. A young woman might be recruited, told nothing, put on a train, and delivered to a walled compound, where she would spend the war operating a machine whose purpose was never explained to her, phoning cryptic results down a line to people she never met, in a town she was forbidden to name. The bombees were given names, some after Commonwealth cities, some after occupied European towns, and the women who tended them learned their moods and their faults the way a driver learns an engine. The compartmentalization was total. A woman in one hut did not know what the woman in the next hut did. Secrecy was not just a rule at Bletchley. It was the very air the place breathed, drilled into every single person who passed through the gates, from the most senior mathematician to the youngest messenger on a bicycle. The war rarely touched the place directly, which was part of the point. Only once did German bombs actually fall on Bletchley Park, on a night in November 1940, and they were almost certainly meant for the railway station nearby, rather than the secret in the grounds. One of the wooden huts was shifted bodily off its foundations by the blast. The staff simply winched it back into position and carried on working. The enemy never understood what sat in that unremarkable cluster of huts beside a Buckinghamshire railway line, and that ignorance was itself a kind of victory, defended by silence rather than by guns. The work was divided among the wooden huts, and the hut numbers became a kind of private language. In one hut, the Army and Air Force messages were broken. In a second, they were translated and turned into usable intelligence and sent onward to the commanders who needed them. In a third hut worked the men and women who attacked the hardest target of all, the German Navy, and in the hut beside it, that naval material was turned into reports for the Admiralty. And it is to the Navy and to the sea that we must now return, because that is where this story was very nearly lost. The naval Enigma was a far harder problem than the Army and Air Force versions, and the German Navy had made it so on purpose. The Navy chose its rotors from a set of 8 rather than 5, which multiplied the possibilities enormously. More importantly, the Navy wrapped its message settings inside an extra layer of secrecy. Where the Army and Air Force operators sent their message keys in a way that Bletchley learned to exploit, the Navy disguised its keys using printed tables of paired letters, called bigram tables, which turned each setting into a different pair of letters before it was ever transmitted. Without those tables, the code breakers were trying to pick a lock in the dark while wearing gloves. Turing, working in the naval hut, developed a brilliant statistical method for weighing which guesses were most likely to be right, a scoring system that let the team judge probabilities and concentrate their limited machine time on the guesses most likely to pay off. But even his methods needed a way in, and the way in was those printed tables, and the tables could not be deduced. They had to be physically taken. For a long time, the naval cipher resisted everything Bletchley could throw at it. What finally broke it open was not pure thought. It was theft, carried out at sea, at enormous risk, by ordinary sailors who often had no idea at all what they were dying for. The code breakers called these thefts pinches. In March 1941, a British raid on the Norwegian coast seized cipher material from a German armed trawler named the Krebs, and that material let Bletchley read the naval traffic for a stretch, and more importantly, understand exactly how the German system was arranged. Then a young codebreaker named Harry Hinsley, watching the patterns in the traffic, had an insight that would prove enormous. He realized that the lonely German weather ships bobbing far out in the North Atlantic carried the same precious naval cipher settings as the U-boats, and almost nobody guarding them. In May 1941, British forces intercepted a weather ship named the Munchen and lifted its settings. Weeks later they took another, the Lauenburg, and captured the keys for a further month. But the most famous pinch of all happened on the 9th of May 1941 in the North Atlantic, and it happened almost by accident. A U-boat, U-110, attacked a convoy and was forced to the surface by depth charges from the British escorts. Her crew, believing the boat was sinking beneath them, abandoned her in a panic and left her floating, intact, with all her secrets still aboard. A boarding party rowed across from the destroyer Bulldog, led by a 20-year-old officer named David Balmay. He climbed down into the dripping, silent hull of an enemy submarine that might sink or explode beneath him at any second, and he began passing up everything he could find. Among the haul was a complete Enigma machine and its settings documents. The capture was kept so secret that the U-boat's own surviving crew were never told their machine had been taken, so the Germans went on believing the boat and all its secrets had simply gone to the bottom. The king himself would later describe it, in reported words, as perhaps the most important single event in the whole war at sea. The effect of that summer was immediate, and it was measured in lives. Through the second half of 1941, with the naval cipher increasingly readable, the Admiralty's tracking room in London could do something that sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet mattered more than almost anything. It could move the convoys out of the way. When Bletchley read the positions of the waiting submarine patrol lines, the tracking room simply routed the merchant ships around them, so that the convoy and the wolf pack never met. Ships that would have been torpedoed sailed on across an empty sea, their crews never knowing how close they had come, never knowing they had been saved by a scrap of decoded German radio traffic. In the months after the break, the tonnage of shipping lost fell sharply, and it fell not because more submarines were being sunk, but because fewer convoys were being found at all. This is the quiet, invisible shape of what Ultra did. Not explosions, but absences. Not the ships that burned, but the far greater number that did not. Then, on the 1st of February 1942, came catastrophe. The German submarine force introduced a new version of its machine, one with a fourth rotor added, and switched to a new Cipher network the British nicknamed Shark. In a single day, the U-boat war went dark. Adding that fourth rotor multiplied the difficulty of the problem many times over, and Bletchley's existing bombs could not cope with it. For most of 1942, at the very moment the U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than the shipyards could ever replace them, the men in the naval hut could no longer read where the wolf packs were waiting. They could only listen to the sheer volume of enemy traffic swell and imagine the convoys steaming blind into the killing grounds. It was the worst period of the entire intelligence war. The men in the hut could count the enemy messages even when they could not read them. They could hear the sighs of the storm without being able to see into it. And out on the grey Atlantic, the merchant seamen paid the price. In the second half of 1942, the U-boats sank hundreds of ships. The number of submarines at sea was climbing month by month as German shipyards poured them out. And without the ability to route the convoys clear, the escorts were reduced to fighting desperate running battles once the packs had already closed in. For most of a year, the single most valuable stream of intelligence in the war had simply gone silent, and thousands of men drowned in the cold and the oil and the dark, while the code breakers strained against a lock they could not pick. The blackout was broken, once again, by sacrifice at sea. On the 30th of October 1942, in the eastern Mediterranean, a U-boat designated U-559 was forced to the surface. Men from the destroyer Petard rowed and swam across to the sinking submarine. Two of them, a lieutenant named Tony Fasson and an able seaman named Colin Grazier, climbed down inside as the boat filled with water and passed up the Cipher documents hidden aboard. They handed the papers to a young canteen assistant who ferried them clear, and then the submarine went down, and both men went down with her. They had no way of knowing that the sodden documents they died to rescue, a set of tables the Germans used to shorten their weather signals, were the exact key the codebreakers in England needed. Those papers let Bletchley find a shortcut back into the four-rotor cipher, because the U-boats enciphered their brief weather reports with the extra rotor turned to a neutral position, which meant a message could be attacked as though only 3 rotors were in play. In December 1942, after 10 months in the dark, the naval hut began reading Shark again. Fasson and Grazier were each awarded the George Cross. Almost no one who mourned them was ever told what they had truly achieved. Even then, the four-rotor cipher remained agonizingly slow to break. The original British bombs had been designed for the 3-rotor machine, and grinding through the vastly larger space of the 4-rotor version could take so long that by the time a message was read, the convoy it concerned had already been found or already sailed safely by. What was needed was a new generation of faster machines built specifically for the 4-rotor problem, and here the war became, quietly, an alliance. The United States had entered the war, and the United States Navy threw its industrial might behind the problem. An American engineer named Joseph Desch, working at a company in Dayton, Ohio, led a crash program to build hundreds of high-speed 4-rotor bombs, machines that spun far faster than anything Britain could produce. Through 1943, these American machines came online in large numbers, and much of the heavy labor of breaking the U-boat cipher shifted across the Atlantic, worked around the clock by American Navy women in a program every bit as secret as the one in England. It is worth remembering, when this is told as a purely British story, that by the end, it was not one. The final defeat of the U-boat cipher was an Anglo-American achievement, built on a Polish foundation, and it took the industrial power of 2 nations to keep pace with the machine that one German engineer had designed in a workshop after the First World War. The intelligence that flowed once Shark was broken again turned the Battle of the Atlantic for good. In the spring of 1943, in the same weeks that Dönitz was losing his submarines by the dozen, the codebreakers were reading his orders, and the tracking room was routing the convoys around his packs. And when battle could not be avoided, The escorts and the long-range aircraft were waiting in the right place. The reading of the cipher did not win the Atlantic alone. Better radar, more escort carriers, more aircraft closing the mid-ocean gap where the U-boats had once hunted safely, all of these mattered enormously. But the intelligence tied them all together and pointed them at the enemy, and in that spring, the hunters became the hunted. The tonnage saved in the winter of 1942 and the early months of 1943 by the reading of the cipher has been estimated in the hundreds of thousands of tons. Behind that dry figure are ships that reached port, and cargoes that fed a besieged island, and men who lived to see the end of the war. Reading Shark again was one thing, keeping up with it was another, because the four-rotor traffic demanded far more machine power than Britain alone could build. And here the Americans entered the story in earnest. The United States had come into the war at the end of 1941, and the United States Navy threw its industrial might at the problem. An engineer named Joseph Desch, working for a cash register company in Dayton, Ohio, led the design of a faster American bomb built to chew through the four-rotor settings. Hundreds of American sailors, many of them young women in the United States Navy, operated these machines in Dayton and Washington. From late 1943, a great deal of the day-to-day battle against the U-boat Cipher was carried by the American effort working hand-in-glove with Bletchley. The breaking of Enigma had begun as a Polish gift to Britain, and it ended as a genuinely Allied enterprise spanning an ocean. Now step back and see the whole shape of the thing. Britain had built an intelligence machine of astonishing power. The decoded German messages were given a special classification, higher than the highest secret then in use, and the intelligence drawn from them was given a single code name that would come to stand for the entire achievement. They called it Ultra. And here Bletchley faced a problem almost as hard as breaking the cipher in the first place. How do you use what you know without revealing that you know it? Because the instant the Germans suspected their cipher was broken, they would change it, and every light would go out at once. The rule became iron. Ultra could almost never be acted upon directly. If Bletchley learned from a decoded message exactly where an Axis supply convoy would be, the Navy could not simply sail out and sink it, because such uncanny accuracy would betray the source. So the British would first send out a reconnaissance aircraft, deliberately in a position where the Germans would see it, so that when the convoy was attacked, the enemy would blame the aircraft, and never the cipher. They invented cover stories with obsessive care. In the Mediterranean, they leaned so hard on this trick that the Axis came to believe the British had hundreds of submarines operating there and a huge fleet of spotter planes, when in truth they had a couple dozen submarines, and on some days as few as 3 aircraft. The British even invented an entirely fictional master spy, a phantom agent running a network of imaginary informants, so that intelligence which had actually come from Ultra could be attributed to a man who did not exist. The intelligence was carried to commanders in the field by small, trusted teams called Special Liaison Units. Their officers would hand a decoded secret to a general, wait while he read it, and then take the paper back and destroy it in front of him. A commander could know exactly what the enemy intended, but he could not keep the evidence, could not repeat it, and often could not even tell his own staff how he knew. This discipline held, with remarkably few lapses, across 5 years and thousands of people. It is one of the most extraordinary feats of collective secrecy in human history. And here, it is worth killing a myth, because a story this dramatic attracts myths the way a hull attracts barnacles. Many people have heard that Winston Churchill, warned by Ultra that the city of Coventry would be bombed in November 1940, deliberately allowed the raid to proceed, rather than risk revealing the secret, sacrificing an entire city to protect the source. It is a haunting story. It is also false. The decrypts warned of a large raid, but they did not clearly name Coventry as the target, and British analysts on the night believed London or the southeast was the more likely destination. Churchill, in fact, turned back toward London that evening, fully expecting the capital to be hit. The truth is less like a devil's bargain, and more like the ordinary fog of war. Bletchley simply did not know enough in time, and a city burned. The legend of the cold-blooded sacrifice is exactly that, a legend. What is not a legend is the scale of what Ultra achieved. In the Atlantic, the ability to read the U-boat traffic let the Admiralty steer whole convoys around the waiting wolf packs. In a windowless room in London known as the Submarine Tracking Room, a small staff plotted the position of every known U-boat on a great chart of the ocean, much of that knowledge drawn from the broken traffic, and used it to route the convoys through the gaps. When the reading was flowing, losses fell. When the cipher went dark, as it did during the Long Shark blackout, the losses climbed again, a grim and unmistakable pattern that traced, month by month, the fortunes of the men in the huts. It was not that Ultra sank the submarines directly. It was that Ultra let hundreds of merchant ships and the thousands of sailors aboard them quietly avoid the place where death was waiting, arriving in port with their cargoes of food and fuel and weapons, never knowing how close they had come or why they had been spared. The effect on the tonnage of shipping that survived the crossing was enormous. In the Desert War in North Africa, decoded messages helped strangle the supplies crossing the Mediterranean to Rommel's army, telling the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force which ships were sailing and when. Before the invasion of Europe, the breaking of the cipher used by German intelligence let the Allies confirm that their vast deception plan for the landings was working, that the German High Command genuinely believed the main blow would fall at Calais rather than in Normandy. The official historian of British intelligence in the war, Harry Hinsley, the same man who as a young analyst had spotted the vulnerability of the weather ships, weighed all of it and offered a careful judgment. His conclusion was that Ultra shortened the war by not less than 2 years, and possibly by as much as 4. He was always at pains to call it an estimate, and to insist that code-breaking alone did not win the war. But 2 to 4 years, measured in the lives that are spent in every single month of a world war, is a figure almost too large to feel. Nowhere did all of this come together more sharply than in the spring of 1943, in the very weeks that opened this story. That season saw some of the largest and most ferocious convoy battles of the entire war, running fights across the mid-Atlantic in which dozens of U-boats hurled themselves at columns of merchant ships and their escorts over days at a stretch. It was a close-run thing. For a few weeks early in the season, the wolf packs inflicted terrible losses, and it was not at all clear which side would break first. But by then, the balance of tools had shifted decisively toward the Allies. The naval cipher was being read again after the long blackout. More escort ships were available, and small aircraft carriers now sailed with the convoys. Long-range aircraft at last could reach the deadly gap in the middle of the ocean that the U-boats had prowled with impunity. And feeding all of it was the steady drip of decoded traffic that told the Allied commanders where the packs were gathering. The combination proved fatal to the submarines. In the space of that spring, the U-boats went from hunters to prey so quickly that Dönitz, unable to bear the losses any longer, pulled his boats out of the North Atlantic altogether. He never regained the initiative in that ocean again, and to the end, he attributed the disaster to radar and to betrayal, and not to the one cause that mattered most. It is one of the strangest facts of the entire war. The man who lost the Battle of the Atlantic was staring directly at the reason for his defeat, month after month, in his own loss reports, and he could not bring himself to name it, because he had been told, by his own trusted experts, that the reason was impossible. So now we return to where we began, to the German admiral and his vanishing submarines, and to the question this whole story asks. If Britain was reading the traffic this thoroughly, for this long, why did the German High Command never work it out? They were not fools. They were meticulous, technically gifted, professionally suspicious men. The answer is the heart of the story, and it is stranger and more human than any spy plot. They did suspect. Again and again they suspected. And again they investigated, and their investigations told them precisely what they wanted to hear. Early in the war, after losses that were hard to explain, the German Navy's own communications experts looked into whether Enigma could be compromised. A senior officer responsible for the security of the cipher examined the question and concluded there was no leak, adjusting a few procedures as a precaution and moving on. When a U-boat was captured in 1941, another formal inquiry was launched under the head of naval intelligence, an admiral named Erhard Mertens. His report stated, in plain language, that a current reading of German messages was not possible. He wrote that the acute anxiety about a compromise of the cipher could not be justified, that the cipher did not appear to be broken. That same admiral would investigate again when the losses became impossible to ignore, and again he would clear the machine. He examined whether the enemy might be finding the boats by radio direction finding, by taking cross bearings on the U-boat's own transmissions, and concluded it could not fully account for what was happening. He examined whether the machine might have been physically captured and satisfied himself that any captured settings would soon expire and could not explain a leak that went on and on. What he could not bring himself to examine seriously was the plainest possibility of all, that the enemy was simply, continuously, reading the traffic as it was sent. That door had been marked impossible before the search ever began, and so the search never once went through it. Then came the spring of 1943, the month of slaughter with which this story opened, and the suspicion flared hotter than ever. Dönitz could feel it. The convoys were dodging his patrol lines too neatly, too consistently, for it to be chance. He ordered the question asked yet again, and yet again, the machinery of German self-assurance produced the comforting answer. The investigators found two explanations that let them look away from the cipher. They had captured documents suggesting that resistance agents in the French ports were reporting when the U-boats sailed, and they had found, on a shot-down British bomber, a new kind of airborne radar set, far better than they had believed the enemy possessed. Here, they decided, was the leak. It was the spies in the ports and the radar in the sky. It was not, it could not possibly be, the machine. Dönitz recorded his conclusion in his war diary. The enemy's information, he wrote, appeared to be obtained mainly from the extensive use of airborne radar. The head of naval intelligence, who had presided over the earlier reassurances, was removed from his post around this time, and a successor took over the question, and the successor too concluded, after what he described as repeated and thorough investigation, that the cipher had proven itself secure. The verdict never changed, only the men delivering it did. Look closely at what happened there, because it is a masterclass in how intelligent people deceive themselves. The Germans were not refusing to think. They were thinking constantly. They were simply thinking inside a box whose walls were built from that original, correct proof, the proof that the machine could not be broken by brute force. Every piece of evidence that pointed at the cipher was reinterpreted, explained away, assigned to some other cause, because the one explanation that fit the facts most simply had already been ruled out in advance as impossible. On one occasion, German analysts intercepted a British report that placed their U-boats with uncanny precision, in positions the boats had reached without ever breaking radio silence, which meant that direction finding alone could not account for it. Even that did not crack the certainty. On another occasion, they noticed that a British message described a U-boat movement using a slightly different word than the original German order had used, and they reasoned that if the British had truly read the order, they would have copied its wording exactly, and so, they concluded, the British could not have read it at all. Their own cleverness had become the bars of their cage. There was a deeper reason too, one that Dönitz himself had helped to create. He ran his U-boat war on a very tight leash, directing the submarines personally by radio, demanding frequent position reports, coordinating the wolf packs from his headquarters through a constant stream of signals. That torrent of traffic was exactly what Bletchley Park fed upon. The more tightly Dönitz controlled his boats, the more messages he generated, and the more messages he generated, the more cribs and patterns flowed into the huts in England. His greatest strength as a commander, his firm grip on his fleet, was quietly, invisibly, one of his greatest weaknesses. There is a bleak irony in it. The very obsession with control that made the wolf pack so dangerous was the same obsession that kept feeding the machine that was hunting them down. Only very late did anyone inside the German system come close to the truth by honest analysis. In the summer of 1944, a naval reserve officer named Hans Joachim Frohwein was set to work studying, rigorously, whether the four-rotor naval machine could in fact be broken. Working the problem through, he concluded that yes, given a captured machine and a stretch of known plaintext, it was indeed theoretically vulnerable. It was a genuine piece of insight, arrived at years too late to change anything at all, and even then, it was hedged and set aside. The war was nearly over. The reading of the traffic went on almost to the last day of it. And when it was all finished, when the war was won and the truth might finally have been told, It was not told. The men and women of Bletchley Park went home and said nothing. They had signed the Official Secrets Act, and they honoured it with a discipline that is genuinely hard to imagine now. For nearly 30 years, the greatest intelligence achievement of the war was simply a blank space in the history books. The generals wrote their memoirs and could not mention the thing that had shaped their every decision. The codebreakers returned to their universities and their ordinary jobs and let the world assume they had spent the war doing something dull and forgettable. David Balmy, who had climbed down into that sinking U-boat at the age of 20, received no public recognition for what he had done for decades. The silence held until the middle of the 1970s, when a former officer finally published an account, and the door began, slowly, to open. Some who kept the secret paid a bitter private price for a country that could not even thank them. Alan Turing, whose mind had done as much as any single person's to win the war in the Atlantic, was prosecuted in 1952 for having a relationship with another man, which was then a crime under British law. He was stripped of his security clearance, subjected to a course of hormone treatment as an alternative to prison, and shut out of the secret work he had transformed. On the 7th of June 1954, he was found dead of cyanide poisoning at the age of 41. It would be more than half a century before a British Prime Minister apologised for how he had been treated, and longer still before he received a royal pardon, and his face was chosen to appear on the nation's money. The man who had helped teach machines how to think was destroyed by the small-mindedness of the very society his genius had helped to save. So we come to the reckoning, and it is not a simple one of clever heroes and foolish villains. The German engineers were not stupid, and the German admiral was not a coward. Enigma was a genuinely superb machine, and the men who trusted it had done real mathematics to earn that trust. The sailors who defended the captured boats and the analysts who chased the leaks were skilled and serious people doing their jobs as well as they knew how. The defeat that overtook them was not a defeat of intelligence, and it was not a defeat of effort. It was a defeat of imagination. They had proven one thing to be impossible, and they had allowed that proof to swallow a second, far larger claim that it did not actually support. They had locked the front door so thoroughly that they stopped believing anyone could ever get in through the reasoning, and so they never quite looked at the window standing open in the reflector, the simple rule that a letter could never be itself. Britain won this particular contest, not because its people were smarter, but because its institutions, for all their snobbery and muddle, left a door ajar for the odd, the outsider, the unmilitary mind. A country that would hand its survival to a shy mathematician who chained his tea mug to a radiator, that would recruit its code breakers through a newspaper crossword, that would set a teenage girl to breaking the cipher of an enemy fleet, was a country with a particular kind of luck. It had the humility, or perhaps just the desperation, to let strange people try strange things, and, crucially, it had received at the 11th hour the priceless gift of 3 Polish mathematicians who had seen the future first. The cost was real, and it was not paid evenly. A drowned lieutenant and a drowned able seaman in the eastern Mediterranean, a generation of German submariners entombed in the cold of the Atlantic, a fictional spy invented to hide the truth from the very men it was being used against, a real genius hounded to his death by the law of the land he had served. The breaking of Enigma saved an incalculable number of lives by shortening the war, and it did so through the labour and the silence and sometimes the deaths of people who were never once allowed to be thanked for it. Karl Donitz, it is said, went to his grave never fully accepting how his U-boats had been found. When he was eventually told after the war how thoroughly his cipher had been read and how a captured submarine had helped to do it, he reportedly could not bring himself to believe it. And in a strange way, that refusal is the truest monument to what Bletchley Park accomplished. They did not merely defeat the German cipher, they defeated it so completely and hid the defeat so perfectly that the men on the receiving end of it could not recognize what had happened even when it was explained to them, even years after the guns had gone quiet. The greatest secret of the war was not only that Britain could read the enemy's mind, it was that the enemy never once learned it had been read at all. If your father, your grandfather, or someone in your family served in the Royal Navy escorts of the Atlantic convoys, in the wireless intercept stations that fed the huts their raw material, or among the thousands of quiet men and women of Bletchley Park who kept their silence for 30 years, their names belong in the comments below. These are the people this story is made of, and speaking their names is how the memory stays alive. Subscribe and stay with us, because there are more of these stories to tell. More inventions that should have been impossible. More ordinary people who were handed the unthinkable, and simply, quietly, did it.